why don't we get started tonight with our show? Nancy, I'm sorry. I'm thinking about Nancy last night at the training.
Because it was amazing. It was amazing. And actually talking about the trainings is a good transition into talking about the Freedom Center legal team and the work that we do. This training series has really been long in coming. The Freedom Center has been really active in doing advocacy work for people in the mental health system for years. I became involved about 1.5 years ago, and when I first started, it was very much just, communicating with people in the mental health system and hearing their stories. And I'm actually so thrilled to be here tonight with my man Louis, because he is one of the primary reasons that we now have a legal team. I actually started advocating, quote unquote, for Louis, total serendipity. I was at Cooley Dickinson Hospital working my regular job, and my shift ended, and I was all set to leave the hospital, but in the elevator there was this sign that said 5th floor inpatient psychiatric unit, and I remembered people saying that Louis had been committed there short term. So I just went up to say hi. Pretty much that was all that I had intended. And it just so happened that that day was the day of his treatment planning meeting. And he asked me to come back and be an advocate for him at the treatment planning meeting. And this was just, totally overwhelming to me, because I, first of all, had just become involved in the Freedom Center, had no idea what my place was, what my position.
How long ago was that?
It's about 1.5 years ago now, right when I actually first became involved. So, I really had no idea, even if we could be there or anything, but I showed up for the treatment planning meeting. It was an absurdly intimidating meeting. They took me into the room and introduced me to about 25 people, all of them, white collar, professionals who were, sneering at me. I introduced myself as somebody who would be advocating for Lee at the meeting, and they laughed out loud at me and escorted me out of the room. Wow. Told me, and Louis was outside of the room too, told me that they would call us when, they were ready for us. So we actually spent 1 hour to 1.5 hours just walking up and down the halls of Cooley Dickinson waiting to participate in the treatment planning meeting. After about 1 hour or 1.5 hours, I don't know, it seemed like forever, they told me I couldn't participate in the meeting as an advocate. So, just that situation right there is enough to really get you involved, because it really...
What you just described is a clear violation of patients' rights to assembly and having advocates that they want, and having people that they want to have at meetings. And this happens all the time at Cooley Dickinson Hospital.
Exactly. And the thing was, at that time period, I had I felt very much that it was wrong, but I had absolutely no legal information to indicate that. I had no idea what patients' rights were, despite the fact that I had been through the system myself. I had no idea what the actual rights of somebody were. And knowing what I know now, I realized that we could have filed a DMH complaint on the spot for Louis not being able to participate in his own treatment planning meeting. That in and of itself is absolutely in violation of the law.
They wouldn't even let Louis participate in his own treatment planning.
Right. Well, didn't you say they called you in for a minute or two?
Yeah, I was introduced to someone named Dr. Ang Fang. He runs DMH in this area, and essentially, I want to just when I first moved here in 1995, I got put in a hospital because I was standing outside. I had dreadlocks because I'm a Rastafarian, and I was standing in front of a Cumberland Farms, I think in Amherst or something, and this police officer rolled up, and it was 5 a.m, and I was smoking some tobacco, and he talked to me, and I figured, okay, well, I had a spliff, and I gave it to him. I said, listen, I'm straight up, everything's good. I don't feel like I should be taken away. But they brought me to their courthouse, where I was starting to speak a lot of Hebrew and Arabic, and I can remember the report that they had. I was speaking Hebrew and Arabic and glossolalia, which is a Christian term for a scientific term for Christianity speaking in tongues, or speaking in angelic tongues. And I was speaking this to the psychologist. I was put in Worcester State, and I ended up spending 1 year in a mental hospital just for that, for having one spliff and speaking Hebrew, Arabic, and glossolalia
And you had never been violent, or and you didn't throw a punch at anybody or smash a window. Yeah, there's nothing in Lewis's history that's like this is a violent, dangerous. And you weren't even suicidal.
No. And I've never been suicidal. Never hurt anyone or myself. Have never been extremely, obtrusive in my speak.
I just want to break in for people who don't know, the legal standard for commitments is you have to be an extreme danger to yourself or others. So, I mean, there's right from the get-go, his legal rights have been violated.
Yeah, this is like the state of psychiatry in America is a totalitarian, corporate, commercial for what people are supposed to think or what people are supposed to do and feel.
So you ended up spending a year in Worcester State Hospital.
Well, no, they transferred me to what is now Parkview Hospital.
Okay.
Where I just was released from there.
How long would that whole process from the point where you were picked up to being in the hospital?
It was very quick. They very quickly took me to Worcester from the courthouse. Mm-hmm. It was. I didn't expect it. I didn't. As a matter of fact, actually, at that point. Because I've been traveling through the country hitchhiking, essentially having dreadlocks in people's communities where they don't know me, and various times police have just come to me and I wouldn't give them my name or anything, and they would say things like he didn't know his name, so he needed to be hospitalized or whatever. I've had bouts of real sorrow, but the real sorrow has come because of my situation, which is that I do not have rights in the state of Massachusetts because of what they call guardianship. That I'm incompetent. They judge my judgment incompetent, and what I'm saying is, this is like saying to me that I don't have the right to think or choose or do things the way that normal citizens of the United States do have the free choice to do because of their judgment terming my psychosis as religious preoccupation, and even from Cooley Dickinson, political delusion, because I had spoken about George Walker Bush Jr. being the beast from the Book of Revelation. And that is something that I studied very deeply and numerologically, worked out his name, and his name equaled that number that denotes the beast, or that number being 666, or George Bush's number.
An awful lot of people that agree with you on that one.
Well, and also numerology is a completely legitimate religious practice. In fact, I was at a meeting where there's a UMass professor that was talking about numerology and Bush and 666. So, I mean, it's not everybody's into it, but it's a completely legitimate perspective.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So these are the types of things I speak to psychiatrists. I spend a lot of time on Indian reservations where they're mining coal and mining uranium to put up these telephone poles that are being used by this society. And I call this road, or as I go through the streets of America, is Golgotha, meaning the place of the skull, or the place where people are crucified, where Jesus Christ was crucified. I look at it as Mother Earth being crucified. I look at it as people being crucified by oil consumption and the misuse of technology. And if you notice, all of these telephone poles look like crosses. I have a song that I've written called Wooden Crosses and Electric Nails. This comes from a Native American perspective that not a lot of people would understand, less they had thoughts that I had, and I would express some of these things to a psychiatrist. They would rule them as delusions and so on and so forth.
So what were some of the other things that happened to you when you were, I guess, at Worcester State and then at Parkview and Cooley Dickinson?
Well, I got electroshock therapy. I was never outspoken. I just kind of walked the halls thinking to myself and praying. But they continually would say that I was manic just because I was walking the halls, probably. And it's hard for me to get way back to that time. But I spent another period of time at, essentially, the first time, the Department of Mental Health worker that I had said that the town of Northampton and Amherst, the towns of Northampton and Amherst, would not allow me to preach the gospel on the streets of Amherst or Northampton, nor allow me to smoke marijuana. So I was singled out as someone who spoke freely about my religious faith on the streets, as well as, professed my Rastafarian belief as marijuana being a sacrament of the Most High, Jah Rastafari. So that was the initial break that I had of my freedom, because they get tenacious when people can talk about their own resistance to the system that they so believe in. They have this persistence about them that wants to impose an intrusion upon the rights of someone who has a perspective that is not in the mainstream of society. Not many people think that they're going through a crucifixion when they're driving their car down the road, but I know that this earth is being crucified by electrical use, by overuse of electricity, overuse of all these things. So,
can we talk about your most recent commitment at Parkview, and which you just 2 weeks ago, right, were released from Parkview, and the situation that led to that commitment? Do you feel comfortable talking about that?
Yeah. Essentially,
maybe I should just interrupt and give some legal information about guardianship. The probate Rogers orders in Massachusetts acts as an outpatient commitment law. Like other states have outpatient commitment law, Massachusetts does not have that technically, but the probate Rogers orders acts on that, and it's a way for courts to impose a medication regimen on patients who they deem incompetent. The way that the law is set up, when a court imposes a treatment plan on a client, or whatever you want to call it, on an individual, there's a substitute judgment protocol that needs to be followed, where the court takes into account everything that a person would want in their treatment if they were competent. So aside from the fact that just being deemed incompetent is in and of itself horrible, because it basically puts you at the mercy of whoever is appointed your guardian. But in situations where that does happen, even, in situations where that does happen, the court is supposed to take into account the type of treatment the person would want for themselves. And I think, Lewis is a perfect example of somebody who, does not want synthetic chemicals in his body.
In fact, one of the things that's so horrible about the situation is that they've been forcing drugs on you to the point, and drugs that are known to cause the risk of causing diabetes, and now you've got diabetes.
Yeah, that happened to Cooley Dickinson with olanzapine. I told the doctor, if you give me this drug, I'm going to get diabetes. And she gave me the drug, then she tested for diabetes, then she found out I had diabetes.
And now aren't they using
my finger every day?
And now they're saying, well, you can't take care of yourself because you're not taking care of your diabetes.
That was
properly.
One of the listed reasons
and they used in
the commitment hearing.
Well, listen, we have Jim Gottstein on the line. I just want to introduce him. Jim is a lawyer educated at Harvard Law School, and he is also a psychiatric survivor. I think he's going to tell a little bit about his own story. And I just want to encourage people to check out the website that Jim has, psychrights.org. It's a fantastic resource for legal issues around mental health, forced drugging, forced treatment, all over the country. And Jim has been involved with cases in Alaska. He's been involved with cases in Massachusetts, and he's definitely, I think, one of the leading, if not the leading, psychiatric survivor attorneys in the country at this point. Jim, do you want to say, first of all, welcome to the show, and I want to thank you for joining us. Do you want to say a little bit about your background and how you got involved with this and the work of PsychRights? And then I think we'd love to hear your perspective on the situation with Lewis, because you're familiar with the case, and I think you can put it in a good context for what the rights issues are here.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm very pleased to be invited. And actually, the first thing I want to just say is how great the Freedom Center is.
Thanks, Jim.
I'm not saying I know what's going on everywhere in the country, but I think I have some familiarity generally and a lot, and outside of Alaska where I get to sue here myself. I think the Freedom Center is really the most active in this area in the country that I know of, and that includes New York, which is trying to get something more going. California, which, as far as I can tell, has virtually nothing. We're trying to get some things going in Michigan, but what you folks have done in the Freedom Center really is just superb and an example of what people that, even just a few people who are united to stand up for rights and advocate and push things, what can be done. So I'm very pleased to, lend whatever assistance I can.
Great. Thanks a lot, Jim. We really appreciate that. And for people might not be aware of this, but actually, apparently there's some kind of deal where Alaska people from outside of the state of Massachusetts, lawyers can practice here if they go through some kind of licensing process. So we're actually in the process of setting Jim up where he can be working with the Freedom Center as an attorney in Massachusetts. So watch out, service providers, because we've got a legal posse that is about to start kicking some ass. So yeah, Jim. So can tell us more about your experience and the work that you do.
You bet. And actually, before I get to that, I want to just react to that a little bit. I got accused of the unauthorized practice of law in Montana for advocating for people.
Oh, wow.
Not really officially.
Who was it that accused you of that?
Huh?
Who was it that accused you of that?
The hospital's a lawyer after I was advocating for someone in the hospital. But it's not really feasible for me to do trial cases there, but if I'm admitted there, I can't be accused of the unauthorized practice of law. And then am looking at trying to do some appeals because the way, as I understand, the system is set up now, basically the paid lawyers to supposedly represent people really aren't paid to take appeals, and so that kind of leaves it leaves the lower courts without any real supervision, and that ends up abusive.
Will you be able to sue people?
And then the last thing I want to say is just how proud I am of Lewis for really, standing up and taking, really some pretty. I mean, to say it's pretty serious abuse that he suffered is really an understatement, and to react without any violence and all that kind of stuff is really a testament, and I really really applaud that.
Thanks, Jim.
You bet. I don't know how much I want to talk about myself, but I was what I call voluntarily hospitalized at the Alaska Psychiatric Institute in 1982 for about a month, where I got some firsthand experience. And when I say voluntarily, I ended up signing in when being faced with an involuntary commitment because I really didn't want it on my record, and I was a lawyer, which. Well, as a digression, those that believed I was a lawyer said I would never do that again. And of course, if I told anybody that I'd graduated from Harvard Law School, that just confirmed that I was delusional.
Although that was totally true.
It is true. But of course, they don't bother to check the facts. Anyway, so that gave me firsthand experience of psychiatric. Well, I would call it abuse, but the system, and I consider myself very lucky. I kind of escaped from the system. I had another hospitalization in '85 for just a week in a private hospital, and haven't had any since. And so, at some point, I could talk about all that sort of stuff, but I don't really think that's.
Well, I think we're probably going to have you back on a show, would get more in depth to larger legal issues, because right now we're really more focusing on Lewis's experience. Exactly. So yeah, we'd love to have you back, for sometime soon on the show for sure.
And I guess one of the things, Abby points out, well, they violated Lewis's rights here and they violated his rights there, I used to say, well, they regularly violate people's rights, but I've actually kind of come to a new way of saying it, which is the system ignores people's rights as a matter of course.
Yeah, I would say that is true.
It's just a matter of course. They just, it's not even an issue.
And
it's like a gang mentality.
And this is actually confirmed by the legal training that we just did with Nancy Sfurida of the Disability Law Center, because she's a very clear-headed lawyer as well, and she sees what's going on in Massachusetts, and it is as a matter of course. We see it all the time in the Freedom Center, and you're absolutely right in pointing out Lewis's courage, because people are so vulnerable, and it's very hard to stand up and to speak the truth and to get legal advocacy for yourself, because you're so dependent on the system. So it's tremendous that that you're here tonight, man.
Yeah. And one of the things I just want to say is, in the legal research that I've done, it was just astounding to me, because I'm very much a person who blames the system for every fault, but especially in Massachusetts, the laws are set up so that mental patients have an extraordinary amount of rights, but they're just simply not being enforced, and they're not being paid attention to. And that to me is terrifying. The fact that, the system actually supports us, but nobody considers it important enough to enforce.
You mean the laws on paper? Yeah, the laws on paper are actually quite good in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and I've got a couple thoughts on that. From my perspective, if there's one place that, the legal system is broken, it's that the lawyers that are appointed to represent people basically don't do it. They're as often as not on the other side. They put up no real defenses. In Massachusetts, it's pretty... I actually read through... There's actually a pretty good manual by, CPCS, the Mental Health Litigation Unit. But it's pretty complicated, so I'm not sure exactly all the ins and outs. But there's some pretty significant things that they won't pay for in addition to appeals. And so the result is, and this is typical around the country, is that people don't get any real representation, and certainly people don't feel like they have, and they haven't. And so the result is that the legal proceedings are essentially a sham. And so one of the things that PsychRights is trying to do is to organize getting, some representation, some real representation for people, and also doing strategic litigation that's designed to really change the system. Because unless you can change the system, then you might win a case here or there. I mean, it's great that you all got Lewis out, but there are probably at least a couple thousand people in his shoes in Massachusetts alone. Yeah. And I recently saw the statistic that basically 1.5 million people a year in this country basically go through this sham legal process and get involuntarily committed. So I put it right at in terms of where the legal system is broken, is the lawyers assigned to represent it. And really, of course, the judges go along with it, and and they just kind of believe, as do the lawyers. If Lewis wasn't crazy, he'd know this was good for him. Well, I mean, that's just not true, and that becomes a justification for, therefore, we don't really need to pay attention to his pesky little rights.
So it comes down to if they don't agree with us, then they must be crazy. If they don't agree with the psychiatric perspective and the pro-drug perspective, then obviously they just don't have insight to their illness, and therefore, which is just a really crazy catch-22 for people to be in.
Exactly. Yeah, it's exactly. I mean, like Lewis mentioned, this competence issue. Well, if I actually have a doc, psychiatrist in a deposition admitting that if see, the deal is people can't force someone. Well, let me put it this way. Everybody has the right to decline the medication. You have an absolute constitutional right to decline the medication. And I don't like to use the word refuse. I like to use the word decline. Okay, you have the absolute right to decline the medication except if you're incompetent to make that decision. So this doctor said, and this is basically the way the system works, if they think you should have the medication and you don't want to take it, they'll just say that you're incompetent, and the judge will go along with it.
And it's hard to prove competency when you have these doctors who the judges listen to as if it were Moses speaking from Mount Sinai.
Exactly, and they don't give you the defendants the right to have your own expert say something different. And and once you get in this situation, I think you talked about it a little bit, but everything that you do, everything that someone does in a hospital setting like that, first of all, they get to control the written record because they put down whatever they want to. But everything that someone does becomes a symptom.
Right.
So
that's true.
think you kind of have a little joke and you laugh to yourself. Everybody kind of laughs.
Essentially, Jim, my mental illness is, I had an attorney study my 1,100-page report at this place, Springfield Hospital. Has changed names many times. He said, these people are saying that you are essentially crazy because of your religion, because of your religious views. And every paper that's ever been signed that discharges me or whatever cites religious preoccupation, religious, basically they use that general term, religious preoccupation, as being my mental illness, wherein I would profess certain things that were outside of especially mainstream psychiatry,
Right, and we have the same thing that happens up here with the Alaska Native population. I mean, there's a belief in spirit world and all that, and if you start talking about that, then you get diagnosed with
schizophrenia,
mental illness. And if you look at the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual, the DSM, they'll flat out say that a delusion is something that not enough people believe. It's something that's not objectively verifiable. But it's only a delusion if other people don't believe the same thing. And so if you happen to be in a religion that not enough people in your area belong to, then they label that a delusion. But this, I don't want to disrespect anybody's religion, but they kind of all have things that are ultimately not objectively verifiable and just go on faith.
That's what makes them religions.
So, anyway, I mean, there are a couple other things that I could talk about.
I'm sorry, I'm wondering if I could just interrupt, because I heard you say that we got Lee out, and I just don't want anybody to get too optimistic about the powers of the Freedom Center, because we actually had nothing to do with Lee being released from Parkview. That was the doctor who decided he was no longer a danger to himself or others.
I'm not. Yeah.
And actually, the entire time that Lee was at Parkview, Freedom Center was denied visitation rights. His guardian, I guess, put in a request that nobody from the Freedom Center visit Lee, which is astounding because we're doing advocacy work for him and we're providing him with support services. When we filed the complaint to challenge that, and we cited an actual law, the investigation was ridiculous, and the law that we cited wasn't even taken into account. So, I mean, that's still
appeal
pending.
It, and maybe I'll be admitted in time to take it up.
Let's keep our fingers crossed. Yeah, it's been appealed, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah. That actually kind of brings me to one of the things I want to talk about is this guardianship issue. That's another one of these aspects where it's just part of this kind of railroading process. And I understand that basically the mental health or CPCS, the people that pay for the lawyers, will not pay for people to contest who the guardians are.
That's
although
true.
It's a little bit confusing about when they will or when they might not.
Yeah.
But really, that's the whole action. That's probably the biggest issue in Massachusetts, because it's the guardian that ends up having the rights. And there's this assumption that, parents love their kids, and I'm sure they do. I'm sure that they do. But that still doesn't mean they should have the right to, absolutely continue to keep their children like they were kids, and control everything that they do. And if they don't, if they don't like what they do, then they put him in the hospital, and then they say none of his friends can come visit him. I mean, it really is outrageous. My assessment is that probably less than 10% of involuntary commitments actually satisfy the legal criteria, including constitutional criteria.
Yeah, you're talking about across the country? Or?
Across the country, yes.
Yeah.
And in my view, no forced drugging is ever constitutionally permitted just because they can't really prove it's in a person's best interest with all
That's so
of
true.
the evidence.
Can you say more about that? Because I think that's a lot of this issue has been sort of taken from the stance of kind of like a civil liberties perspective of whether someone has the freedom to be outside of the hospital. But I think one of the things that's innovative about your work and also what we're trying to do with the Freedom Center is pointing out that, look, the drug treatments don't work the way that they say that they do. They just flat out don't work the way the pharmaceutical companies are telling people that they work. And you're saying that there's actually a legal way to use that as a way of saying, look, the different alternatives should be tried other than forced drugging.
Right. Well, there are a number of constitutional principles involved, and I have written some papers on it and all that that people can download from the psychrights.org website. It's right on the front page. But basically, the rationale for forcibly drugging people, and besides the person being found incompetent to decline, is basically that it's in the person's best interest. And they have to generally prove it by more than just more likely than not, or what's called a preponderance of evidence. They have to show that it's God, I can't even remember the term right now, but it's highly probable that it's in the person's best interest. And really, I think when you look at the facts, you just can't do that. And the psychiatrists get up. There's only the psychiatrists for this state get up and say, "Oh, this is in the person's best interest," and there's no one on the other side. But the facts are that there, even under the best of their own studies, there's a pretty high percentage of people that it doesn't really affect at all in terms of knocking down the symptoms. For everybody, there are serious health risks. In fact, more than health risks, it's almost a certainty that if you're on these drugs long enough that you'll have health problems as a result of them. What these drugs do is cause changes in the brain. So everybody's heard about a chemical imbalance and all that, and there's absolutely no evidence for that before people get put on these drugs. And then what happens is that these drugs block some of the brain functions, specifically the transmission of dopamine. And one of the brain's responses is to actually grow more dopamine receptors. So then what happens is that actually kind of creates an abnormality in the brain that makes the person more sensitive to dopamine. So then when you go off the drugs, and people just hate these drugs, then often people do experience psychiatric symptoms, and it's because of the drugs. And so what the statistics show is that when people get put on these drugs, and I'm talking about the neuroleptics,
they're addictive.
They're addictive. But in terms of the legal process, when people are put on the drugs, it makes them slightly more likely to have a relapse. Okay? But once they're on the drugs, and if they go off the drugs, it dramatically increases the likelihood of a relapse. And so what's happened, there's a medical term called iatrogenic, which means caused by the treatment. And so what we have is just a huge amount of iatrogenic psychiatric symptoms.
And in the culture as a whole, there's like this idea like, oh, so-and-so is off their meds, so that's why they're crazy. And because the idea is that, oh, the craziness that pre-existed is sort of coming up and they need their medication to... But actually, often when someone is off their meds, they're going through withdrawal effect, and the craziness that they're showing is an expression of that withdrawal, the side effect of the drug itself.
That's right. And one of the really terrible things is that they don't tell people that this is likely. And so if you are forewarned that this is pretty likely to happen, then you're not as scared by it. You can say, well, I can maybe get this through, because many people really can get through that period and become fine. In fact, most of the people that or psychiatric survivors who really have completely recovered have gotten off their drugs.
I was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and I'm off drugs completely now. So it's possible. I think Abby's doesn't take drugs.
I just wanted to bring this conversation back to Lee's situation, because I think what's really interesting is the reason why Lee was committed to Parkview is because he was resistant to treatment. I think it was every 2 weeks.
Yeah, every two. This is what was happening. Every 2 weeks, I would have to get a shot of risperidol. Risperidol, when I first took it, now this is very interesting, Jim. I'm what they call, I have a opposite effect with the drugs. Like if they give me drugs, I'll start hearing voices. Right. So I was given risperidol in Florida, and as soon as the first day I took it, 6 hours later, I started hearing all these voices, and after 2 or 3 days, I was hearing the same voices every day at the same time. And I was being given this drug, risperidol, and it kind of feels like a razor blade traveling through your neurology. And I was told if I could, this Dr. Ang Fang and the DMH, he's the head of the regional DMH office here, he said that, they had deemed it, without my consent, of course, because I don't have rights here, as being considered a guardianship, that I would get a shot of this drug every 2 weeks. And if I didn't get a shot of this drug, the police would come with the ambulance and take me back to the unit to get a shot and stay for, however long they thought it was that I should have to stay. So this is essentially what led up to going to Springfield, was an absolute denial of my ability to refuse medication, even on a probate Rogers. And my friend, who's an attorney that was spearheaded the closure of Northampton State Hospital when it was closed down, he spearheaded that. He told me, they really can't enforce a probate Rogers, but I was one of the only people in this area that they actually imposed that on.
And
I have no record of violence or, being violent to someone or hurting myself, suicidal.
Right.
And
Louis, you described it as you said a razor blade moving through your neurology. Would you consider this a form of torture that you're going through?
Yeah, many times I've felt I've been tortured by psychiatric drugs, like being on the drugs, being in the hospital. I was, pretty much praying to God that, this is torturous, this is really hurting my brain, this is really affecting me, I don't know what to do. No one can see it. When I leave this room, no one will see it, but the feelings of having, I almost felt what I must have been close to what it was like of having a frontal lobotomy, because they were giving me risperidol by mouth. It was happening. My heartbeat was going up to 120 to 144 beats per minute, and they weren't doing anything about it. They just kept giving me risperidol. And in the physician's desk reference, it is written that if these drugs cause you to have a heartbeat of 110, 115, 118, more than once, like an extended week time, take them off the drugs immediately. This doctor was just giving me risperidol without even considering the wellness of my,
And I think this is actually
body.
just one of the reasons why your story is so incredible and ironic, is because for about a year you had been going through short-term commitments at Cooley Dickinson because you wouldn't take your shot, and they would come and pick you up, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they threatened you with a long-term commitment if you refused. And that's why you ended up in Parkview.
Right.
They followed through with that, even though, of course, it's illegal, yada, yada. But the thing that's so ironic is when you were transferred to Parkview, a lawyer was present who recorded your heartbeat and got you off risperidol because she took note of your heart rate in front of the nurses, and immediately you were taken off of the drug, which is...
A lawyer had to be there for it to happen.
Exactly. I mean... It's just really, it's like comical in a way if it wasn't so painful for you, that this happened. I mean, it was just ridiculous.
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk about torture, and this is something that's happening in the psychiatric system. People are essentially being tortured. I mean, it's part of a bureaucratic medical mindset, but the experience that people go through is, and I just can't emphasize more how important it is what Lewis is doing, what you're doing by speaking out about this, because so many people are going through similar kinds of things, and they're just too crushed, they're too vulnerable, they've been basically silenced. And so for you to speak out and to be working with lawyers and to trying to get some kind of way of dealing with it is really a tremendous thing, and it may have incredible repercussions because we're going to stick with this.
Yeah, like Jim, I would like you to be I would like myself to be your first case, and ask Jesus if you get the license to practice here, you know.
All right, well, we can talk about that.
Yeah.
We'll see where things are at.
Because it's really hard finding a legal person who can, get cut through all the other legal person's malarkey and all the other stuff and straight get to, what is the issue. The issue is liberty. And people are not at liberty if they can't speak what they want, feel what they want, act how they want, within the realms of not hurting themselves or another person, and and be free. Once a segment of society is considered to be not allowed to exist outside of incarceration, or what is even more scary, forced drugging. For some people, it's scary, but forced drugging. Once people get in this rut, it's a self-perpetuating system of not only hospitalizations, but poverty on the place of the person who's the victim of this, and then also the immense amount of money that is spent on upkeeping these places where the nurses are like they should be given jobs at they really don't. These nurses don't know anything about like what's going on. They have no clue. And
do
doctors
they hide behind a glass window there?
Yeah, they hide behind a glass window, and also these silhouette psychiatrists who deny any religious experience. There's one saying that we used to say, and that's, why is it that when a man talks to God, it's called prayer, but when God talks to man, it's called schizophrenia? I've been speaking that one for a while.
Well, so Moses must have had schizophrenia
too.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of this, comes to what you were saying before, Jim, and people are familiar with this issue in the criminal justice system, is that, okay, there may be some safeguards that the system has set up, and in fact, it's very important to remember that all the safeguards that do exist on paper came as a result of the psychiatric survivor movement activism, especially in the early 70s. So it's very important to remember that what protections that there are in place are a result of activists, not the system, not lawyers, but activists. And the reality is that the system is not following through with providing the resources, the money to actually pay for legal representation for people, because it just becomes, like you said, just a sham. There's no actual implementation or enforcement of what's down on paper in the DMH regulations and the state laws and federal laws.
Well, one of the things I think, and that's it's really exciting for me to work with the Freedom Center on this, is how important it is for the lawyers to representing people to really change their attitudes that it's really best for their client if they lose. And people, I don't think you said anything that we gave the Freedom Center and I and Bob Whitaker, Dan Kriegman and Dr. Grace Jackson gave a legal seminar to about 30 lawyers in Massachusetts who do these cases. And the main thing was to really let them know how terrible these drugs really are for people, as a way to jack them up. And so we've got a pretty significant cadre of lawyers who really, I think, are kind of on board in that. And I think that's really a significant development. And I had a chance to meet Nancy last fall, and she's terrific too. So I don't want to say all the lawyers are bad, but day in and day out in the regular course of things, people do not get anything like effective representation.
Yeah, and if there's, that's the money is so much of it here. If there's anybody listening who has access to large amounts of money or knows anybody who has, or even small amounts of money, it can make a real difference. I mean, we had to scrape together some money just to help get Jim through the filing so that he can be practicing in Massachusetts to help us out. But we're an all-volunteer organization. Jim isn't making a lot of money on this. He does a tremendous amount of pro bono.
Actually, I do it all pro bono.
Okay, there you go. This is a lawyer who works all pro bono.
That's really respectable.
I think, isn't that because of a previous case that you had won? You were able to get some money as a result of that, or how did that work?
Well, different things, but basically I can do it for a while, and I think it's so important. I'm going, kind of slowly broke, but I've got some things going.
That's for a good cause.
may get me financially well, but
going broke for a good cause is.
Absolutely. And so as long as I can, I'm gonna do it.
So that's how bad the situation is in Massachusetts. We had to turn to a lawyer in Alaska to help us out. So. Well, yeah, people, please, remember to check out Jim's website, which is www.psychrights.org. And this is the Freedom Center's mental health show. And we are a mental health support and advocacy group. You can take a look at our website, which is www.freedom-center.org. There's a lot of articles about forced treatment and forced drugging on our articles, resources, and information page. So we have a few minutes left. Are there other things that folks want to add before we wrap it up here?
I really want to urge anyone listening to, if you really want to get into, some of the grassroots beginnings of this whole concept that we've been speaking here about, is Dr. Peter Breggin, who was a Harvard psychiatrist, who found that he's written books, one of them called Psychiatric Drugs, Brain Killers. He's done, scientific studies about things that totally contradict what is called mainstream psychiatry, and he's considered a well-respected psychiatrist in the Washington area. So Dr. Peter Breggin is a good person to read about.
Some of Dr. Breggin's work is on our website. Also, Robert Whitaker's work is excellent, and there's just a ton of articles and resources that people can take a look at the website. So, Abby, you have anything you want to add at the end? I want to thank everybody.
I'm just thrilled that Jim's here and Lewis is here, and it's been a great show. Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks everybody for coming. Thanks, Jim, for joining us from Alaska, and we will be back next week. So thanks everybody for tuning in.